Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today I have on Jack Herrington, and we're going to discuss mainly React state management today, but we might go across some different tangents and stuff like that as we go. So I think
tangents on a podcast? No way.
Yeah, no kidding. I think a good place for us to start out here, Jack, is if you could just give like a brief background on kind of what has led you to get to where you are today, producing some really great content on your channel and kind of being what I would say is like a leader in this kind of educational space for React developers and just kind of development in general. So could you kind of give a brief background on yourself?
Let's see. So I started really doing this YouTubing thing when I was working at Nike. You're familiar with, I'm sure, Nike, and I was a principal engineer over there. Got the
shoes on right now.
Oh, really? They're too tight for me. So it's funny. Like when I was working on the campus, it was a thing where it's like, you have to wear Nike on the campus. And then, I couldn't because they're too tight, like too thin. And so I ended up wearing Doc Martens all the time.
There you go.
Because we didn't make competitive shoes with Doc Martens. So and Doc Martens is super nice. Anyway, okay. So I was doing like brown bags there. And they had this prohibition on any kind of public speaking. And so I was like, I really like this. I like talking to folks about it. And I just like investigating new technologies. And then I think the easiest way to learn them really well is to teach other people. So I started getting into that, and turns out actually they didn't monitor the prohibition too much, and I would never talk about anything Nike on the show. So they didn't care. I mean, it was like I don't know, 1,000 people at the time, 1,000 subs or something. And, so it's been really great. And it's just, it's nice to be able to highlight open source stuff. Like I've been looking a lot at what Daishi Kato's been doing out of in his work on Jotai and Zustand and a couple other popular stuff, and now Waku work, which apparently I'm getting schooled on the pronunciation of that one too. Waku something, I don't know. Anyway, it's his competitor with Next.js, and it's cool because this has always been a thing. Like you mentioned state management, and this has always been a thing for React since the early days of React. React was just a Vue library, and so it was unopinionated about what you'd use under the covers to manage your state. And so it was always a thing. And they came out with a Flux pattern and then Redux, and Redux didn't feel very good to me personally. So I was always looking for alternatives, got into MobX and various things. And now, boy, it has just exploded. But it's also gotten so much more complex because now we've got like Next.js 13 and how do you manage state on the server, and how do you work that with the back end with your client state. And I think people also get a little confused about and they infer a lot of magic, like somehow this state manager is going to somehow magically connect between the server and the client, and it's going to manage state between the two. And you're like, there's no magic here. So you kind of got to do that for yourself.
Awesome. Well, I think that gives a really good kind of introduction, background about yourself, why you're interested in development, and then also state management in general. So I think a good place for us to start here, just to kind of set the floor. I know that when I first started learning development and stuff like that.
When was that? I mean, so just so we know each other now.
Yeah. So for me, I started learning probably about 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, wow. Nice.
But I didn't go fully into it probably until about 3 or 4 years ago. So,
okay.
I would still definitely qualify myself as like definitely early career earlier on. But been around long enough now to where I feel like there's some things that I could share at least. But I also, one of the reasons why I do this podcast is because it's just like selfishly talking to people with more experience like yourself and stuff like that is super valuable for me. So,
oh my gosh. Yes. That's the thing. Like I've definitely felt if you're in a company and you know more, and don't take this the wrong way. I mean, obviously, if you feel like you know more, or you're actually like in meetings and you're teaching everybody, that's not a great place to be. You kind of want, kind of a 50-50 thing, or where you're learning a lot. And there are certainly companies where I was at where I was like, wow, I felt crushed. But at the end of the day, you're like, oh, I learned so much, but it was a little intimidating. But yeah. And if you don't have that, then making your own podcast, or trying to get out there, go to meetups. Another great place to meet other developers and to talk about things. A lot of great options.
Yeah, absolutely. And I originally come from a fitness background. Like, I actually have a master's degree in exercise science. So
hey, cool, nice. I used to teach Muay Thai at the local gym.
I actually train Muay Thai, and I train that alongside jiu-jitsu, which I have just a little bit of cauliflower ear going on right here.
Well, mine is more like cardio kickboxing for like the local folks kind of thing.
Yeah. Mine's at like a gym to where there's legitimate UFC fighters. So
geez. Okay, that's a bit different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely odd that level for sure. But I'm in the beginner/intermediate classes for sure. I'm not playing with the UFC anytime soon. Man, those guys
that would be cool.
It would be cool, but those guys are killers. I need this brain for software engineering stuff. So
this is a quick aside. Did you hear the one? I'm not sure whether he's still a football player, but like he was like a linebacker or a lineman, and in addition to being an NFL lineman, he was also publishing these crazy high-end math papers on like these just amazingly insane topics. And they're asking me like, well, how does this work? We're working on the math stuff, and he's like, well, there are days I just want to hit somebody. And there you go. The NFL, they can pay you to hit somebody. And you're like, okay, all right.
I can't remember who it is, but I definitely know who you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Shoot, I wish I remembered it off the top of my head.
Super awesome guy.
I can definitely relate to that. I like having kind of both outlets for like.
Absolutely. I think you have to do that, right? Mm-hmm. You actually can take skills from one domain and move them into another domain. And Absolutely. It's really cool. Like you'll do a lot of like, personal stuff, and you'll be able to take that into your work environment. And obviously, how to, not be aggressive on the job and all that kind of thing. And,
yeah. I would say if anything, like, training jiu-jitsu, I also like lifting weights and stuff. Doing that sort of physical stuff makes me so much calmer throughout the rest of the day to just kind of like chill, focus on work and stuff like that. So I definitely think there's a lot of carryover, and kind of where I was going with that is in the fitness space. I actually had my own podcast for that stuff. And I feel like the number one thing that kind of would accelerate my learning over there is like talking to people that had specific expertise in these different areas. Then also, like you said earlier, trying to teach it myself. You quickly realize how well you understand something when you go to actually like explain it in simple terms to someone else. And sometimes it kind of can be a little bit of a filter or kind of magnify what you don't know as well, which is definitely important. So,
well, as this podcast grows, and as I've definitely experienced it. Like in my early videos, I said stuff that was just completely wrong, whatever. I'm looking back, I'm like, oh, that was not right. And nobody cares. Like, the 50 people watch it. They're like, whatever, man. But like nowadays, oh my God, I get like one tiny little technical thing wrong, or I get a pronunciation wrong. And it's like, I just get an infinite content and comment thread about, like, okay, all right. So it helps you a lot to drill down to the level where you really feel comfortable if anybody kind of probes various areas. And also, I would say, where you feel comfortable saying, I don't know. I actually, go back to the author on that library. I have no idea, because that's the thing. Like, there's so many combinations. I mean, getting, kind of drive us back into the state management system. There's just so many combinations of things that there are not a lot of right answers. And I think that's what a lot of folks struggle with, is when you're in the coding boot camps and stuff, there's the right answer and there's the wrong answer. Redux is what you use when you have a state management problem for React. And it's like, no, actually that was maybe the case like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. Certainly not the case now. And there are a lot of options, and it's never black and white. It's always very gray.
Yep, absolutely. And we will dive into some of those options here later in this episode. But where I did want to start is, as I was saying, when I first started learning about development and stuff, the whole like concept of state was kind of confusing to me. Like I never really, it was hard to put my finger on like what people were even talking about when they would say state management or state or how you could lift your state through props. I was just like, what is going on here? So I think a good place for us to start is like, what do we even mean when we say state, or what does like state management even kind of refer to?
Right. So imagine you have like a form app, you know, so you're just collecting some information, like a survey or something like that, right? So there's the code that actually maintains like the check boxes and all of that, right? Displays stuff. And then there's the state, which is the person's current answers. And what React is doing is it's using your components to render that state into HTML. And so it's essentially a one-way line, right? You change state and then your components re-render that state, and React then takes that re-rendering and looks at the current screen and says, well, what changes do I need to make to actually, make those two things sync up? And this is a big difference this is a big win for React. Like, I think a lot of folks coming in the last, as 5 years, 3 years, whatever, or even the last decade, because React has been around for so long, we just kind of assume that this has always been the case, that you would have this really cool way of taking state and make sure that it's absolutely synchronized with what's on the screen. But that's not the case. Like back in the day, we had jQuery, and in order for us to like do a form, right? If somebody clicked on a button, you'd have to go grab the form element or whatever, select it, do all the HTML stuff, but also go and set some data somewhere that was like, okay, when we're ready to post back to the server, here's going to be that data that we're going to send back. And those two things, because you had to manually do that, would oftentimes lose synchronization between those two things. And so you could get into a state where the UI and what you thought was the data were two different things, and that was really bad. And so what the revolutionary thing that React brought to the party was those two things, as long as you write your components the right way, will never lose track between the state of your application and the UI that's being presented. And of course, nowadays, like people they're so new into this that they like try and get around that. And it's like, no, please don't do that. That's the win. That was the good thing. Please don't try and get around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that you mentioned in one of your many quality videos on React was you kind of mentioned the thought process of it's kind of React's job to take the current data of your application, the current state, and just to turn it into HTML to what the user sees. And I think that kind of like simplified way of looking at it, like I think people can sometimes get lost when they're thinking about React and like, okay, you have all these different components and hooks and props and functional components and class components, although we don't worry about those as much anymore. But you have all these different like kind of intricacies of React, in which when it just kind of boils down to current data turning into HTML, I think it makes it a lot easier to reason about. So I really liked kind of that simplification in your video.
You have to come from that base knowledge of like, this is the truth of what React is. And then we're just sort of, layering on top of all these kind of concepts. But definitely you have to start understanding also like, so there's, you got to make sure that you understand like React has these two concepts, right? State, which it doesn't actually it did, I guess, a little bit in class components. That was kind of grungy. And then they added hooks for functions, and those added a new state management paradigm called the reactive state model, except that most people don't use it that way, into the mix. And then so you have to kind of differentiate these two things. There's the state, which is what your form answers are or whatever. I'm going to keep drilling on that example. And then the components that are the things that take state and create HTML in the case of React for DOMs, or React for HTML. And then there's also React Native. I mean, that's one of the cool things about React too, is like you can take the skill and move it into a whole bunch of different domains. Like, I was looking at Remotion yesterday or a couple days ago. It was like, you can make videos out of React. It's crazy. How cool is that?
Yeah. I've played around with React Native a bit and making some apps in that. And I think knowing kind of React for the web makes it so much easier to write apps for React Native. It's
absolutely
makes it so much easier.
And it's really cool that you can take that paradigm, right? You can, and translate it so easily into a really nice actual performant app. I mean, this is not BS. These are, you can ship React Native. Many companies do. And that's really cool because you can take a small team of, 5 developers or whatever, 2, 3, 4, 5 developers, and then make a big impact because you can share code between your HTML page and your HTML site and your React Native site or React Native app through like mono repos and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that kind of set up on what state is, I think now for a very general and broad question, how does someone even go about kind of managing state in React? Like, does React give someone certain tools to manage state just within the React library, or how does that kind of work?
Right. So yes, absolutely. React. Let's just deal with hooks because you're right. Class components are not really I would say not really a thing. So we're talking about functional components and hooks, and it offers 2 ways to attach state to a component. And one of those is use state and the other is use reducer. And I've heard back in the day that actually reuse reducer or use state is really just a simplified use. Yeah, or use state is a simplified use reducer. So whatever, it's one really. And then you have a couple of verbs, I guess, that allow you to look at that data and then do things based on when it changes. One is use memo, and that allows you to go and calculate a value from an existing value. So, for example, like let's say that you have some state that has the first name and some state that has the last name, and I don't know, whatever you don't want to just like put that in the form as is or something. I don't know. You want to like conjoin that or something. Like you could use a use memo for that, although that's not like. There's times you don't need to use it, which is also confusing. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt out there about people saying that it's not the right thing to ever use it and whatever. And then there's use effect, which is everybody's favorite hook. And that allows you to basically do something, take an effect in the world, like maybe go make a fetch or something like that based on when some data changes. Like if you have a piece of a search string stored in your use state and you have a use effect that when the search string changes, then you go off and make a fetch. And then there's use callback, which is for managing callbacks. So this is all sum total what they call the reactive state management paradigm within the React library itself. And that works for React on the web. It works for React in native, works wherever you have React, it all works. And then so I actually think if you're looking at it from a learning structure, like get that down first, because everything that you're going to rely on kind of depends on that. And then the step up from that is to start sharing state between components. And then we start talking about different ways to do that. And the primary one, I guess the easiest one, but still built in the library, is context. So you create a provider, a piece of context, and you may have it up at the top level of your application. Normally, that's where all those providers go. See the big old list of like emotion provider and material wire theme provider and all those providers. You can go make your own provider and then provide data. Like as an example, the currently logged in user could be part of your context, and then you have a use context hooks wherever you want to grab on to that data to go and find who the user was. And then React is smart enough to be able to track, well, hey, you were using that user context here and you're using that user context over there. And then when that context changes, it goes and updates those spots, for you, which is really nice.
Awesome. I think that provides a really good overview on kind of the out-of-the-box solutions that React gives for kind of managing state and doing some of these things. So I think that... And
if you didn't follow any of that or whatever, if it's not working for you auditorially, kind of thing, I did a pretty decent a walk, like almost an hour long walkthrough on Free Code Camp, where we walked through from the basics, all of it, and then into like state management and the state management options that you have and all of that, or state manager options. I mean, you could one of the biggest questions I get asked is, can you just not even use Redux or not even use whatever, all these fancy names? And yeah, that's true. At a certain size of application, yeah, you can just get away with like having some use state or use reducer. And then probably the most likely thing you layer on top of that is like an SWR or a React query, because you, in order to do anything interesting in an app, you have to go and call back to somebody, unless you're doing even when you're doing a game. And React query is probably the easiest way to do that, or SWR. So you could probably get away with just React query or SWR, and then the basic data and the basic state management tools built into React, if that's the way you want to go.
Absolutely. And I think that I don't think it would be super helpful to dive like into the technicalities of like how use state works, how use producer works, and go through that, as I think for a lot of that, you just kind of have to see it and play around with different examples. And you do a good job of that in your course on Free Code Camp. It's like almost like a 3-hour course on managing state.
It was such a... I don't make videos that long normally. I've been getting into shorts lately, which are a minute.
That's a marathon for sure.
And yeah. And so like my normal videos are maybe, 15 to 30 minutes. And the Free Code Camp guys are like, yeah, no, it has to be 90 minutes or more. I'm like, what? Oh my God.
That's crazy.
And I look on there and there's guys that are basically just doing a lecture. It's not even edited. And you're like, okay, well, all right. But I want to edit and stuff and all that. Yeah. Okay. So go on.
Yeah. So where I was going to go with that is maybe we could cover just a few different like examples of using these tools. So let's assume that someone maybe has an idea of how use state and use reducer works, but they don't really know like when you would use one or the other. So like, are there situations in which you would kind of opt to use reducer instead of use state, or do you kind of see them as totally interchangeable and you can use them both to kind of create state and use state? Or how do you kind of think about using one versus the other in your apps?
That's a great question. I look at it kind of from the perspective of grouping data. Like if you've got a lot of fields if you got one object that has a lot of fields in it, and those fields are kind of interrelated, like as an example, the form, you got like the biographic stuff, first name, last name, address, blah, 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 blah. That I would say I've seen people do like the huge list of use states, first is a use state, last is a use state, blah, blah, blah. I would definitely bring that all into one use reducer. In fact, actually, I have a pretty good rule of thumb that if you have more than 3 hooks, just in general, in your component, that you should start thinking about making a custom hook. And so you can kind of extract that from the presentation code. You can extract the logic of the form from the presentational stuff, the return with all the HTML and all that. And then you can actually go and unit test those two in isolation. So you could use the hooks testing stuff to go and test just the logic of that hook. Like as an example, you may have a forms thing where you need to like go and check to see, hey, did they fill in a first name or last name or whatever? And then you can go and check to make sure in your unit test, like, okay, I didn't mess that up. Like, checks to see all that stuff. And by the way, if you're screaming at the podcast right now and saying, what about forms management systems? Like, it's just an arbitrary example, guys. And I would definitely recommend that. Like I use React Hook Form, RHF, in my day job. So that's a great one. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good distinction, and I probably use them very similar. Like if it's like several pieces of kind of connected state, I tend to prefer a reducer, but if it's more like an isolated one-off piece of state, I tend to go for the use state hook. So I think that's a really good one. Are there any other like common problems you see people run into when trying to kind of manage state? I know in your video you kind of mentioned people running into potentially infinite loops because they don't realize that like they're reinitializing a function on every render and then updating state with that and doing things like that. Or are there any kind of common mistakes that you see that are pretty regular when trying to manage state in React apps?
Certainly the infinite loop around use effect is a big one that I see, but I think actually more kind of daily use one that I see a lot of folks have is that they don't understand like the order of execution of things. Like as an example, classic example is you have that counter, right? Yeah, use state, count, set count, start at 0, have a button, add the button, go, right? And then inside you have like an on-click function that you created inside your component to like, okay, set count to count plus 1, you know, now I've got a counter, right? Super easy. But you ask people like, what is the value of count after that set count plus 1? And they're like, oh, that should be 1. You know, if it started at 0, it would be 1. And it's like, no, actually count is still going to be 0 because you're holding a copy effectively of the original value at the time when the component was rendered. And then it's only after the set count fires and the component is marked as dirty because you've changed state that is associated with that component. And then the component re-renders and now you get 1 as count. But when you create that function, it's locked at 1, you know, so you'd put a console log in there, you'd see 1, even if you added 1. And understanding those little tricky bits, because that has nothing to do with React. That's all about like how closures are managed and the fact that like you created this event handler kind of back in time and now you're invoking it now. And it's like, whoa, it's a little trippy, but once you get the hang of it, you get it. And there are some solutions for that, like set count. All the set state functions allow you to take the current value and then return a new value based on that as a function. And that's actually there's some common wisdom out there that you should only use that version of set state. I think it's actually not too bad. Like if you decide to go with that, that's fine. You know, I can't argue with that. But yeah, so get that down. Understand why that's the case, and then start looking into cracking that nut of like the use effect thing. 'Cause man, use effect, whoo, it messes people up. Some fears because you have the dependency array, and it's the dependency array that gets you. If you don't put it in a dependency array, that's just straight bad. Just never do that because that's just basically saying like, you know, run this code, but it doesn't run at the right time. It's just weird. And then there's the empty dependency array, which is, hey, run me on startup of this component. And then there is the dependency array that has dependencies in it. And you got to watch out because if you have a dependency on something that the function inside of the use effect writes, then you can get into this really tricky situation of an infinite loop. And an example would be like, okay, so I've got an interval that I'm going to go create inside of my use effect that's going to go and make a timer, right? You know, whatever. And I want to set that count so that every second it goes up by 1. But if you have count in the dependency array, you'll get an infinite number of timers because you actually like the calls and then it creates a new timer and that just gets a unholy mess. So it's a powerful tool and you can get messed up and tangle up sideways in it really easily. I think the nice thing though is that, you know, you don't really need to use it all that much. Like a use effect, we generally use it for fetching data. And as I say, you should use React Query or SWR for that. So there's usually, it's an interesting thing to think about and reason about, but hopefully on a day-to-day basis, it won't get you, but maybe it will. I don't know. Depends on what you do.
Absolutely. And I think kind of paradoxically, that could be one of the tricky parts about use effects is because you don't honestly write it that much when you're just like in your day-to-day coding. So it's almost always like, it's complex enough to where it's like, how does this work again? And then you're trying to write it and it's like, you're kind of lost at it.
Yeah, totally.
So I think that's a really good point. And we use SWR for most of our kind of querying and stuff like that. So I definitely recommend that solution. I haven't used React Query, but I've heard it recommended by a ton of people. So that's probably also good.
Yeah, SWRs are like really lightweight. I think it's 4K of a library. And then so it's very fundamental. And then React Query adds a bunch of features and then get up to a stunning 12K for the library. But you do get a lot of benefit for that. And Tanner Lindsley's amazing and his examples are amazing. So,
well, I think right alongside of that, we do have this, before we wrap up here, we do have this kind of internal state management within React using useState, useReducer, and the different things we talked about. And then we also talked about doing kind of the data fetching part with React Query or use SWR, are there other packages external to React that you like to use? I know you mentioned some kind of in our intro, but are there kind of any go-to packages that you like using, or any packages that you're like, hey, pay attention to this one, they're working on some really cool stuff, or anything like that?
There's three I would say that you should pay attention to. For work, probably a library called Zustand, Zustand, German name, go figure. And it is very similar in pattern and style. Well, in pattern, meaning like just unidirectional data flow, to Redux. It's just that it's so much easier to use. It's quite crazy in comparison. There's none of these action creators and dispatchers. And, oh my God. Blah, 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 blah. It's like so easy to use. Crazy easy to use. And it's really good for like async stuff as well. Like you just, hey, I have something. I'm just going to like click a button and it's going to go off and do something. You put the fetch code in your Zustand. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Zustand model. And away you go. Right. And then there is a personal favorite that I use in all my personal projects called Jotai. And Jotai is is another variant of something recoil. These are atomic state managers. So every piece of data is managed as an atom, and then you can relate atoms to other atoms. And I'm a spreadsheet guy, right? And I love the idea that like I think of each atom is like a cell, and you can say, equals A1 plus A2, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And I do everything on it. Like, how much we're going to pay for building a fence or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Spreadsheet ahoy kind of thing. And I just love that model of like, okay, I have a salary atom and I have a bonus atom, and then I can make a total comp atom that combines those two. And whenever either of those change, it just automatically updates. And I don't have to worry about any of that. That's wonderful.
Is that similar to recoil at all?
Yes. Yeah. It's gotcha. Recoil. There's three of them. There's recoil, there's Jotai, and then there's nano stores. I think recoil was a cool idea, and it sort of inspired the other two, I guess. I'm not sure when nano stores history, but Jotai has taken it way to the next step. They've integrated with things like XState and Immer and React Query and all of these fantastic libraries. So any atom can be internally very complex, and that's cool. And then I guess the third one would be XState. If you have as an example, like classic, think about a game, right? If you have like one of those story-driven games where you got to get the sword, and then you got to get the gem, and the gem goes into the sword, and then you got to go and attack whatever and whatever, yada yada. That's a state machine, right? You either have the sword or you don't, and then when you're in this. And you have the sword, now you're in the sword state, and then you got to go get the gem. And that's the only next transition from that is to get the gem. And now you get the sword and the gem together. And then you got every video game. And once you learn this, you're like, oh my God, video games are not so great anymore because I know how they're made. But XState or state management or state trees or state machines. Sorry, finally I'll get there. That's the underlying mechanism, and XState makes that really easy to manage. So if you have a scenario where you've got like discrete states of UI, another good example would be like a wizard form. I need to fill out the biographic stuff, and then I got to fill out like, here's where my purchase is going to go kind of thing. And you're in one state or the other, right? That's a fantastic thing for that. So those three, I would say, in terms of external state management utilities, would be the ones I would recommend getting into.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, that's a good place for us to kind of call it here. If people are like, hey, this guy knows his stuff, I want to follow what he's doing, where can people go online to kind of consume more of your resources and to kind of go find you?
Consume my resources.
Yeah, I don't know. That was a weird way to phrase
that's
that.
Cool. I like it. Sure, use my reason. You're more along the lines of using YouTube's resources. I'd say the channel is probably my number one thing, and that's kind of what I'm working on primarily now, just to try and get folks. That's the main entry point. Although I do want to get more articles and stuff written as well. Go back into that for a bit. We'll see. And do more podcasts like this one. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it was a blast. It was super helpful.
Yeah. If I'm ever, where are you located?
I'm in Denver.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, if I ever go to Denver, I'll have to check out we can grab a coffee and then go check out the Muay Thai kickboxing.
Absolutely. That sounds like a blast.
And I'll get my butt kicked.
Well, I do as well. So I'd be right there with you.
There you go.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.